Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, and I should have said this in my initial comments, you know, on the occasion of a bill like this coming through, it's worth just considering the horrific events that took place in the English Channel this week with desperate migrants being in a boat that capsized and losing their lives, and how the seas around Europe have become a graveyard for thousands and thousands of desperate people who are just fleeing war and persecution, desperate conditions, and losing their lives, men, women and children, in the most horrible fashion. And we saw a very, very stark example of it this week. And I think it's always worth contemplating how, you know, we were in that situation once upon a time. And indeed, we suffered the same demonization and mistreatment that those desperate people suffered. People losing their lives trying to cross oceans from this country to flee hunger and poverty and mistreatment, suffering terrible treatment often in the countries we went to, at least initially, until we organised and fought for our rights and improved our situation. So I think it's just worth saying that, and suffering the same racist stereotypes as well. It's well worth reminding ourselves. I'm often fond of quoting Marx and think Karl Marx was interested. But one of the things he was particularly interested in was the plight of the Irish worker and the demonisation of the Irish worker in Britain in the middle of the 19th century, and how the magazines, the popular magazines in Britain, used to demonise the Irish workers and present them as less than human, as monkeys, a stereotype that was later applied to people of different colour. But that early stereotype was applied to the Irish. And one of the things Marx said was that the mistreatment of the Irish worker and the racism and the exploitation directed at the Irish worker was the secret weakness of the British working class movement. Very telling phrase. In other words, the degree to which the working class movement in Britain allowed anti-Irish racism to persist weakened their movement. Not just did it mean the mistreatment of the Irish worker, but it weakened the struggle of the entire British working class. Because if one group of workers, in that case the Irish workers, were treated badly, paid badly, exploited, that was used as a stick to beat all the other workers. And that remains the case. That remains the case. And workers in this country need to understand they have a stake in ensuring that migrant workers in this country are not exploited, are not treated badly, have rights and entitlements, because if workers do not, and if we, particularly when you understand how important those workers are in something as critical as food supply, then their poor conditions, their mistreatment will actually be a stick to beat other workers and to keep their conditions down. And of course, you know, you can see the connection in the sense that that mistreatment in a situation of large-scale illness among migrant workers in an industry where they have very few rights and where there is a history, as has been documented, of inspections showing more than 50% of the time, even before COVID, breaches in labour rights, employment rights, permit issues, and so on, that if that is allowed to persist, it will be bad for all workers. And it is actually worth commenting, I think, Minister, when you think about it, along the food supply chain. We've had, in fact, some of the people who contacted me to alert me to the mistreatment of the workers in the meat plants during the COVID pandemic were beef farmers who had been part of the beef plan movement. Very interesting, very good, because they themselves were fighting against the miserable incomes they, as direct producers of beef, have, average incomes of 10 to 12,000 euro. Unbelievable. I couldn't believe that when the beef plan brought that to my attention, how poor the incomes were for the people who actually produce one of the biggest exports this country has, and that generates absolutely enormous profits for the big agri processors, the Larry Goodmans of this world. Staggering profits made by those people, but the direct producers, the farmers, on a pittance, the people who are processing the meat in the meat factories in terrible conditions, sleeping in dormitories, COVID rampant, very few rights. And then you go the next step along the chain, you have the low-paid retail workers in Tesco's and the shops and the supermarkets and so on, who are some of the frankly most poorly paid workers, often very, very precarious conditions. It's kind of telling, isn't it? Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Supermarkets. I didn't mention their name. Sorry, it was a slip of the tongue. Yes. And very, very low paid. That says something, doesn't it? You know, the food we eat, one of the most basic things we need to sustain our society, and pretty much everybody along that chain, whether they're Irish, whether they're small farmers, migrant workers, or the people who work in the shops, all pretty poorly paid. So this is part of trying to address that, and if we're serious about learning some of the lessons that we learned, which everybody, including the government, proclaimed during COVID about the role of these essential workers, their importance to our society, it has to be tangible and meaningful what we're going to do. And you won't be surprised to hear, Minister, that I'm not happy with your responses in terms of our bill. First of all, is 4 weeks for personal illness or injury, or 6 months at 70%, what we're proposing, is that excessively generous and an excessive burden on the employers? Well, it's not, first of all, when you look at the profits that are being generated in those areas. Enormous profits. Right, so I don't accept that the big beef barons can't, who also we've discovered sometimes hide their profits offshore in Luxembourg or wherever it might be, couldn't afford to pay decent sick benefits to the workers who help generate those profits. I don't accept it. Secondly, I'd like to point out that in Germany, a worker will receive 100% of their wages for the first 6 weeks. 100%. Whereas what the government is proposing in theirs will be 70% of their salary for 4 days. Sorry, 3 days, starting with 3 days and working up to the height of it, 10 days. So we are so far behind the rest of Europe in these things, and I don't believe, you know, it's not an excessive burden in these other countries, in Germany and elsewhere. Why should it be an excessive burden on employers here? So I don't accept that excuse. Secondly, the question of work permits and whether, if you don't have a valid work permit, that therefore you shouldn't be entitled to the social insurance fund or to the WRC. We have cases on this. We have workers who had permits, okay, then got in disputes with their employer because the employer was treating them badly. The workers stood up for themselves. They were mistreated. The WRC found that they were mistreated, and had they had the entitlement, would have received awards and compensation, but they didn't get it because their permits had expired. Why did their permits expire? Because their employer didn't wanted to make sure they didn't get their additional permits because they were troublesome workers. Right? That can't be allowed. Right? So they had made reasonable efforts. They'd previously had permits, wanted to have permits, but didn't have permits because they were in a dispute with their employer, which in a case where the WRC actually found in their favour. Right? So your answer does not answer that point. And a similar point, of course, could go for those. The implication of what you said is that if they didn't have permits, then they couldn't have been paying PRSI, therefore weren't entitled to the fund. Why would you assume that? Almost certainly they are paying PRSI, but they don't have the permits. They've made the effort to get the permit. They don't have the permit, but they are paying PRSI in most cases, or were paying PRSI until permits ran out or an employer didn't want their permits to be maintained. And finally, the issue of is central demand of MRCI and others has been that employees should have the right to move from their employer and to have that spelled out explicitly. The truth is, in reality, it is extremely difficult. You say it's provided for. In reality, it is extremely difficult for migrant workers attached to particular employers to move from those employers, and it needs to be stated explicitly in law that they have the right to do that. So I would appeal to the government to reconsider, not to oppose this bill, and let it progress. If you've got tweaks you want to make, let's do it at committee stage, but don't block the bill, which is intended to actually enhance the rights of migrant workers and all workers.
Thank you, Deputy.